A man who built something real doesn't talk about it much. He just shows up. Every morning, same time, same cup of coffee, same route to the job site before the crew gets there. That's how you build 31 years in the contracting business. Not by being loud about it, by being there when nobody else wanted to be. So when my daughter stood up at my own retirement dinner and told me I had controlled her entire life, that every good thing she'd ever had came with strings attached, and that she was done letting me pull them, I didn't raise my voice. I set my glass down on the white tablecloth my wife Diane had picked out 3 weeks in advance, and I looked at my daughter the way I'd looked at 100 bad contracts over the years. I just waited for her to finish. Then I folded my napkin and walked out of my own party. Welcome, friends. Get comfortable, because what I'm about to tell you took 32 years to fully play out, and it didn't end the way anybody at that table expected. Least of all my daughter. My name is Ray Calloway. I'm 63 years old. I spent the better part of 4 decades building Calloway & Sons General Contracting out of a single pickup truck and a name I was determined not to embarrass. We do commercial builds now, mostly. Medical offices, small schools, a few government contracts. Started with bathroom renovations in Columbus, Ohio when I was 29 years old and didn't own anything worth insuring. My daughter Claire is 34. She's smart. Sharp the way her mother is sharp, sees the whole room at once. Knows who's worth talking to before she even sits down. I paid for her business degree at Ohio State. I co-signed her first apartment. I walked her through her first car loan so she understood exactly what she was signing. Every step, I was there. Not hovering. Just there the way a good foundation is there. You don't notice it until it's gone. She'd been with a man named Derek for 2 years before I met him. That alone told me something. My son Marcus had brought every serious girlfriend home within 6 months. Claire, who tells her mother everything, had kept Derek like a secret she wasn't sure she wanted to admit to. When she finally brought him to Sunday dinner last spring, I understood why. Derek was the kind of man who answered a question about himself by asking you one back. Smooth. Practiced. The kind of practice that doesn't come from confidence, it comes from habit. He shook my hand too long, complimented the house twice in the first 5 minutes, and never once asked me anything about the business. Not how'd you get started, not what kind of work do you do, not even a polite what's keeping you busy. Just compliments pointed at the furniture and questions aimed at Diane. I noticed. I always notice. Diane kicked my ankle under the table twice during dinner, her version of a full written warning. By April, Claire had told her mother that Derek had a business opportunity he was putting together. Some kind of investment fund, distressed commercial properties, he called it. Buy low, renovate, flip, or hold for rental income. She said it the way people say things they've been coached to say. The words were right. The confidence underneath them wasn't hers. I didn't say anything that Sunday, but I started paying attention the way I pay attention to a wall that doesn't look quite right. You press on it a little, see if it holds. It didn't take long to find the soft spots. I asked my business attorney, a man named Phil Garrett who's been with me since my 3rd year in business, to run a quiet search on Derek Marsh, his fund, and the 2 properties Claire had mentioned by address. Phil called me back inside of a week. What he found wasn't criminal, not yet. But it wasn't clean either. Derek had 2 previous LLCs, both dissolved. One in Indiana, one in Kentucky. Neither one had ever filed a return. The properties Claire mentioned were real, but one had a lien on it, and the other had changed hands 3 times in 18 months, in a way that didn't suggest a renovation, it suggested someone moving paper. There was no active fund registration, no broker's license under Derek's name, no investment disclosures filed anywhere Phil could locate. I sat on that information, not because I planned to use it as a weapon, but because a man who built a business from a pickup truck knows that information is only useful when the other person is ready to hear it. And Claire wasn't ready. Not even close. Her retirement dinner announcement came the following month. She was leaving her marketing job of 6 years to help Derek manage the fund full-time. She said it at Sunday dinner with her chin up and her hands flat on the table, the way she used to sit when she was 16 and waiting to see if I was going to argue with her about curfew. I asked 3 questions. What's the fund's registered name? What state is it incorporated in? Who's the custodian for investor funds? She answered none of them. She said I always did this, turned everything into an interrogation. That I'd questioned every decision she'd ever made, that I'd never once just believed in her, and that she was 34 years old and she didn't need my approval to make a choice about her own career. Diane's hand found my knee under the table. Same hand, same warning. I told Claire I'd been asking about Derek's fund, not her career. That those were two different things. She said they were the same to her. We finished dinner without another word about it. 3 weeks later, I got a call from Diane at 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. Claire had called her, crying. She and Derek were in, she said. They'd found their first real property, a strip mall outside Dayton with 3 vacant units and a motivated seller. But the deal had a hard close date and they needed to move fast. Derek's other investors were already committed. Claire just needed a bridge. $120,000, 60 days. She'd pay it back with interest before the end of the quarter. I asked Diane one question. Was Derek on the call? No, she said. He was letting Claire make the ask herself. I told Diane I'd call Claire back. I didn't call that day. I called Phil Garrett instead. Phil confirmed what I suspected. The strip mall was real. The seller was real. But Derek wasn't listed as the buyer on any pending contract Phil could locate, which meant either the deal wasn't as far along as Claire believed, or Derek's name wasn't the one doing the actual buying. Phil said he'd keep digging. I told him to take his time. I had a retirement dinner in 4 days, and I wanted to know what I was walking into before I sat down at that table. Phil called me the morning of the dinner with what he'd found. I got dressed in the dark that morning the way I always do. Diane was still sleeping. I made coffee, stood at the kitchen window watching the neighbor's sprinkler misfire on the sidewalk for the 14th morning in a row, and I read Phil's email twice on my phone before I put it face down on the counter. Derek Marsh had a partner, a woman named Sonia Patel, who ran a small consulting firm out of Indianapolis. Phil had found 3 instances in the past 4 years, 3 different men, 3 different cities, 3 different investment opportunities. In each case, a romantic partner had made a funding request to family. In each case, the family money had moved. In each case, the romantic partner had quietly exited the relationship within 60 days of the close. Derek wasn't building a fund. He was running a play. And my daughter was the door. I put the email away, got dressed, drove Diane to the restaurant. I did not tell her what I knew. Some things a man has to let reach their own conclusion, not out of cruelty. Out of the same principle I learned my second year in business when a subcontractor I liked was skimming materials on a job. I didn't fire him the day I found out. I waited until he'd done it in front of 2 witnesses and a sight camera, because a clean ending matters more than a fast one. The dinner was at Moretti's, a place Diane had picked because I'd taken her there on our first real date in 1989. 31 people. My business partner Leo and his wife, Phil Garrett and his wife, my son Marcus and his family, a few of the longtime crew foremen with their families, and Claire, who arrived 20 minutes late with Derek's hand on the small of her back and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The evening went fine for the first hour. Toasts, stories from the job site. Leo telling the one about the permit inspection I'd slept through in 2004 that everyone had already heard 8 times. Diane crying quietly when Marcus stood up and talked about watching me leave before sunrise every morning when he was a kid and not understanding until he was grown what that cost. Then Claire stood up. She thanked me for everything I'd built. She said she knew I'd sacrificed. She said she loved me. And then her voice shifted just slightly, the way weather shifts when you're not looking at the sky, and she said that she hoped, now that I was stepping back, that I could finally let her step forward. That I'd spent 30 years building something of my own, and she deserved the same chance. That she was making a change in her life that scared her and excited her, and what she needed from her father was not another question, not another audit, just trust. The table went quiet, in the way tables go quiet, when everyone realizes the conversation is no longer about the occasion. Derek put his hand on hers. I said, clearly and without heat, that trust is built on something. That I'd spent 31 years building a company precisely because I never confused faith with due diligence. That I loved her completely and unconditionally, And that love was exactly why I was not going to hand $120,000 to a fund I could not verify to a man whose previous two businesses had dissolved without filing a single return. She said I had no right to look into Derek's background without telling her. I said a father has every right to know who's sitting at his table. She said I had made her feel like a suspect her entire life. That my version of love was a contract with conditions. That she was done performing for my approval, and done waiting for me to decide she'd earned her own choices. That I had never, not once, simply trusted her. Her voice broke on the last sentence, and Derek squeezed her hand, and I watched him do it. I watched him squeeze it the way you squeeze something you intend to use. I stood up slow. I looked at my daughter for a long moment. And then I said the only thing I could honestly say at that table in front of 31 people who were now studying their bread plates. I said, "You are the best thing I have ever built, Claire, and I will not watch you be demolished." Then I set my napkin on the table, put my hand briefly on Diane's shoulder, and walked out of my own retirement dinner into a Tuesday night in Columbus, Ohio. My phone started in before I'd reached the car. Marcus first. "Dad, just come back in." Then Diane. "Ray, please. She's upset. Just come home." Then nothing from Claire for 47 minutes. Then a text. "You humiliated me in front of everyone I care about. You couldn't let me have one night. This is exactly who you are." I sat in the parking lot of a Moretti's for 20 minutes. Not because I was angry the anger had gone somewhere quiet the moment I stood up, but because at 63 years old, after 31 years of building something real from nothing at all, I needed 20 minutes in the dark to let that sentence land and then let it go. I drove home. Diane was already there, sitting in the kitchen in her coat, not having taken it off yet. She said, "You knew something tonight that you didn't tell me." I said, "Yes." She said, "Was it bad?" I said, "Yes." She didn't push. 32 years of marriage, and she knows when the information will keep until morning. I showed her Phil's email over breakfast. She read it twice, very still, the way she goes still when something costs her something. Then she set my phone down and looked out the kitchen window for a long moment. She said, "Does Claire know?" "Not yet." Diane nodded slowly. Then she said the thing that had been true our whole marriage and continued to be true even when it frustrated me. She said, "She has to find out herself, Ray. You know that." I knew that. Claire didn't call for 6 days. Marcus told me she was staying at Derek's, that she'd told him I'd publicly humiliated her and proven exactly what she'd been saying for years, that I didn't believe in her and never would. Marcus, to his credit, listened without agreeing. He's got more sense than to get between me and his sister when we've both dug in. On the 7th day, Diane called me at 9 in the morning from the grocery store. Claire had called her. The strip mall deal had fallen through. Derek said the seller had backed out. He needed more time to find the next property, and he needed Claire to be patient. When she'd pushed for specifics, what did the contract say? Can I see the escrow documents? When do I get back my 60,000? Derek had gotten quiet in a way she didn't recognize. She'd sent the money, Diane said. Her voice was careful. The way it gets careful when she's telling me something she knows is going to cost me. 60,000. Her own savings, not mine. She'd done it 3 days before the retirement dinner, before she'd ever made the ask to me. She'd already moved the money. I sat with that for a moment. Let the full shape of it come clear. I said, "Tell her to ask him for the escrow account number and the name of the title company handling the close." Diane said, "She already did. He said he'd get it to her by end of day." That was yesterday. I called Phil Garrett, told him what I knew. He said he'd already found something I needed to hear. The strip mall outside Dayton had closed escrow 9 days earlier. Different buyer, different deal. Whatever Derek had told Claire about a pending purchase, it hadn't been this property. The address she'd wired her money toward wasn't a title company. It was a personal LLC, one of Sonia Patel's dissolved entities, reactivated 2 months ago in Indiana. I told Phil to send everything to Roger Dunn at the Columbus DA's office. Roger and I go back to the year I built his brother-in-law's dental office, and he owes me a favor I've never called in. I called it in that afternoon. Then I drove to Claire's apartment. She buzzed me up without asking who it was, which told me she'd been waiting for someone. The apartment was tidy the way a place gets tidy when someone has been cleaning out of anxiety rather than habit. She'd been crying recently. Not in the last hour, but in the last day. You learn the difference when you raise a daughter. She said she didn't want to hear I told you so. I said I didn't come to say it. I sat down at her kitchen table, told her everything Phil had found, the dissolved LLCs, the 3 previous cases, Sonia Patel, the title company that wasn't a title company, the strip mall that had already closed without Derek's name anywhere on the deed, the money that had gone into an entity that existed on paper and nowhere else. She listened without interrupting. That alone told me how far the ground had dropped out from under her. Claire has been interrupting me since she was 4 years old. When I finished, she said, "How long have you known about Sonia Patel?" "Since the morning of the dinner." She went very quiet. I said, "I know what you're going to ask, and the answer is the same one I gave you at the table, except now you're ready to actually hear it. I couldn't tell you at dinner. Not because I wanted to humiliate you, because you had already decided I was the problem. Anything I said about Derek that night was going to land as control, as interference, as me once again refusing to let you live your own life. You needed to push on that wall yourself before you'd believe me that it wasn't holding weight." She said, "So you let me lose $60,000 to prove a point." I said, "You lost $60,000 the day you wired it. I didn't make that happen. Derek did. And the woman who recruited him, and the system they'd run twice before they ever met you. I found out in time to stop the 120 from following it. That's the one thing I was able to do." She said, "I called you controlling in front of everyone you work with." I said, "Yes, you did." She said, "You built that whole company. 31 years. And I stood up at your retirement dinner and told everyone you'd ruined my life." I said, "You said what you believed at the time." She started crying then. Not the kind of crying that wants comfort immediately, the kind that needs to run its course first. I got up and made her a cup of coffee, the way I've been making it since she was old enough to drink it. Cream, no sugar. Set it in front of her and sat back down and let her finish. When she settled, she looked at me across the table, and she said, "Dad, why do you always know?" I said, "I don't always know. I just pay attention, and I've been paying attention since the day you were born." She asked about Derek. I told her he'd stopped answering his phone that morning. His apartment I'd had Phil check had been vacated, lease broken. A neighbor told the building manager he'd moved out over the weekend. The same weekend he'd told Claire to be patient. He was already gone before she'd called her mother. She put her face in her hands, and I let her. After a while, I said, "Phil's already sent everything to the DA's office. There's a pattern across 3 states. Yours isn't the first case, and the documentation is solid. You won't get the 60 back. I want to be straight with you about that. But you won't be the last name on that list." She nodded without lifting her head. I said, "There's something else I need to tell you, and I need you to hear it the same way you heard the rest." She looked up. "Last October, before any of this started, before Derek, before the fund, I had my attorney put together a document transferring partial ownership of Calloway and Sons to you and Marcus equally. 31 years of equity split down the middle. My retirement gift. It's been sitting in Phil's safe since November, signed and notarized, waiting for me to hand it over on the day I actually stopped coming into the office." She stared at me. "I also opened a business development account 18 months ago. $250,000 set aside specifically so that when either of you wanted to build something real, not a scheme, not a rush, close with a hard deadline, and no documentation, you'd have backing from someone who already knew how to read a contract and wouldn't charge you interest to do it." "Dad," she said. I said, "You had all of that. You had it the whole time you were sitting across from a man who gave you a made-up address and a dissolved LLC and called it an opportunity. You had it the whole time you were trying to figure out how to ask me for $120,000 to hand to someone whose name I couldn't find on a single piece of legitimate paperwork." She said, "Why didn't you just tell me?" I said, "Because a man who hands his daughter everything she needs the second she's frightened teaches her that fear is the right way to ask. You weren't going to come to me with a real plan, as long as you believed I'd only say yes out of guilt or obligation. I needed you to come to me because you trusted me, not because you'd run out of other options." She was quiet for a long time, long enough that the coffee went cold. Then she said, I owe you an apology that's going to take me longer than today to give you properly. I said, I know. I'll be here. She said, I meant what I said about you not trusting me. I believed it when I said it. I said, I know you did. And someday, when you've built something yourself, something real, something that has your name on the sign and your decisions in the foundation, you'll understand that what you called control was just me knowing what a bad wall looks like before it falls on somebody I love. She didn't say anything to that, just sat there in her kitchen with a cold cup of coffee and the particular expression of a person who has stopped arguing with something because they've run out of places to argue from. The ownership documents didn't transfer that day. I want to be honest with you about that, friends. I didn't walk out of her kitchen and hand her the keys to 31 years of work because she'd had a hard week and cried at her kitchen table. She started coming into the office in November, not as an owner, as a student. She sat with the project managers, learned how a bid gets built, asked Phil questions about contracts that I'm fairly certain surprised him, made mistakes, and owned them the way her mother owns mistakes, completely and without excuse. On a Thursday in February, she came into my office with a business plan. 8 pages, single-spaced. Expansion into residential renovation, a segment we'd deliberately stayed out of for 15 years because the margins were inconsistent and the client relationships were harder to manage. She'd found 3 market opportunities within 40 miles of Columbus where commercial contractors weren't competing. She'd run the numbers herself. She'd had a banker look at the projections before she brought them to me. I read every page. I asked her 12 questions. She answered 11 of them cleanly and told me honestly she didn't know the answer to the 12th yet, but she knew how to find out. I pushed the documents across the desk. She looked at them, then at me. I said, those have been in Phil's safe since November. They're yours. They were always going to be yours. She picked them up the way you pick up something that has weight you weren't prepared for. I said, there are conditions. She said, there are always conditions with you. I said, the expansion comes with a separate budget line and a 6-month review with Phil in the room. The business development account is accessible for legitimate capital needs with a signed proposal and my co-signature for the first 2 years. After that, it's yours completely. She said, that's fair. I said, more than fair. She almost smiled. It looked like her mother's. We've been in the same building since March. Different offices. I stop by the project she's running on Wednesdays the way I used to stop by my crew foreman in the early years, not to check up, but to be there in case there's something worth talking through. I'll tell you what I told Leo the day I signed those transfer documents. Some men earn respect by demanding it. I spent 31 years earning it by showing up. I don't need my daughter to be grateful. Grateful fades. What I need is for her to know what a real foundation looks like, so that when someone hands her a wall that doesn't hold weight, she presses on it before she builds her life against it. She knows now. That's worth more than a retirement dinner. If this story meant something to you, friends, hit that like button and let me know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below. I read every one of them. And subscribe because the next one is one I've been carrying for a long time, and it's worth the wait.